useless Labour government are doing the impossible. They're actually making things worse. They really are. Look who we've got running the country at the moment. Free gear Keir. Or never hear Keir. We've got Rachel from accounts. We know her, don't we? Angela Rayner, the no-brainer. You got Mad Miliband, that net zero fanatic. And let's not forget our very own mastermind, David Lammy.
Keir Starmer found himself at the centre of one of the biggest financial scandals in British history. His government seemed to have reached the height of political confidence when in an instant everything collapsed. British citizens were shocked to learn that the promised £22 billion financial disaster had been made up. It was this deficit that became the basis for the harsh economic policies that caused a slew of tax increases, cuts in social spending, and the introduction of austerity measures that affected millions of people. As it turned out, however, the whole financial black hole story was a carefully planned manipulation. When Starmer and his team began warning the public of the impending economic collapse, they operated with dire figures and dire predictions. It was announced that the UK was on the verge of financial collapse, and unless emergency measures were taken, the economy would simply collapse. This was done in order to justify tough economic decisions. Starmer assured the country that it was necessary to raise taxes, cut public spending and apply austerity measures. Otherwise, the consequences would be catastrophic. All of this was presented as a necessary response to an extraordinary financial hole.
He's a proper chopper, isn't he? You know what, here at Reform UK, we've got Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Rupert Lowe, all successful businessmen and politicians. We've got Zia Youssef and Nick Candy, again, in the back room, all successful businessmen. We've also got now Elon Musk and President... and President Trump as friends of Nigel. All right. But who do Labour have speaking out for them? Carol Vorderman and David Lammy. What a load of rubbish that is.
However, it soon became clear that the story of the peace £22 billion deficit was nothing more than an artificially created crisis. Economists and financial analysts began to put revelations out into the public space, showing that the numbers on which this whole financial crisis was based were inflated and the data was skewed. Many experts pointed out gross errors in calculations, the use of outdated forecasts, and sometimes outright falsification of information. One by one, economists began to denounce the deficit as nothing more than a fictitious scenario to justify policy decisions that under normal circumstances would never have been accepted by the public. Most strikingly, it wasn't just a few reporting errors or incorrect assumptions behind the deficit. It was an entire political plan, carefully calculated and planned to create the illusion of economic catastrophe and force the British people to adopt austerity measures. The objective was simple: to create fear and uncertainty among citizens by presenting them with a choice. Either they take painful measures or face imminent collapse. By doing so, Starmer and his team wanted to consolidate their own power by presenting themselves as the only ones capable of dealing with the crisis, even if they had to take the hardest economic steps to do so. Public opinion was skillfully manipulated. Every day on TV screens, there were messages about the inevitability of the crisis. Every speech of Starmer repeated the same thing: if we do not act immediately, we will face financial collapse. Thus, the government decided to use not only numbers and facts, but also psychological pressure. The more people felt threatened, the easier it was to sell solutions that in normal circumstances would have provoked fierce opposition. At first, it was hard to believe that an entire political force would be willing to engage in such manipulation. Gradually, however, as more and more analysts began to debunk this 22 billion myth, doubts began to fester and public confidence in the disaster began to fade. Starmer and his team tried to save face, but the cracks in their political strategy became increasingly visible. Within the Labour Party itself, questions began to arise. Many parliamentarians who had previously supported the party's course began to openly question the veracity of the data. These doubts did not go unnoticed, and soon leaks began to emerge confirming that the figures on which the entire economic plan was based were blatantly overstated, and some of them were even falsified. All of this jeopardized Starmer's future as leader of the Labour Party and his government. Although he continued to assure that his decisions were based on economic necessity, figures and facts began to put things into perspective. More and more people began to realize that this was not just an error or overcalculation, but an entire political manipulation. The true goal was not to save the economy, but to hold on to power by creating an artificial crisis that didn't exist. Keir Starmer and his government masterfully used the artificially created financial disaster as a political strategy to consolidate their power rather than solve Britain's economic problems. The absence of a real economic threat was replaced by a carefully constructed myth that led millions of Britons to believe there was a crisis that caused a £22 billion deficit. In reality, there were no real financial problems behind the crisis, just an artificial panic inflated to catastrophic proportions. But why did Starmer and his team go for such manipulation? The answer was simple: control. Trying to convince the public that Britain was on the edge of a financial cliff, Starmer and his ministers followed a long-established political script: create a crisis, inflate it to unbelievable proportions, and then propose solutions that would normally be met with massive resistance. Raising taxes, cutting social programs, tightening economic policy, all these measures were presented as the only way to save the country from imminent doom. Thus, the government not only justified its unpopular measures, but also strengthened its position by presenting itself as the only savior of the nation, capable of making difficult decisions for the sake of the country's well-being. But this strategic manipulation of numbers and facts was not a simple mistake. All of the data on which the whole deficit scare was based was inflated and inaccurate, as independent economists and analysts have confirmed since the crisis was first exposed. However, Starmer and his cohorts were not going to give up so easily. They continued to exploit fear by creating a sense of extreme urgency about the situation. Their narrative of financial collapse became more memorable and powerful by the day, and their main goal became to convince the public that tough measures were not only reasonable but necessary. Following this, they began to actively utilize the media platform to push their agenda. The media, which was in a so-called political alliance with the Labour Party, relentlessly repeated claims that the country was on the brink of financial disaster and that the government's proposed austerity measures were the only way out. The media were used to convince the public of the absolute rightness of the government's decisions and to impose the idea that opposition to these decisions was the path to financial ruin. The more the repeated reports of peace 22 billion were heard from TV screens, newspaper pages, and radio airwaves, the more real this threat became in the minds of citizens. It wasn't just manipulating the facts, it was playing on people's psychology. When information is repeated long enough, it begins to be accepted as true reality, no matter how much it was initially exaggerated. The challenge for Starmer and his team was to create a powerful sense of fear and urgency. A regime of "if we don't act immediately, we will collapse" was imposed on all sectors of society. The total austerity measures that resulted from this artificially inflated crisis were presented as inevitable. Opposition, objecting economists and independent analysts were quickly silenced, and the whole debate was that salvation could only come through the tough measures proposed by the government. And if you doubt the rightness of the government's actions, then you are an enemy of economic stability, someone who risks ruining the country. The Labour media played a special role in supporting this narrative, effectively becoming propaganda sharks that actively work to create panic. Rather than questioning or investigating the veracity of the peace 22 billion figures, these media simply replicated the government's claims, supporting the idea that the UK was on the brink of financial collapse. All journalistic work was reduced to repeating the government narrative. This became not just a perversion of the facts, but a full-fledged campaign to instill fear in the masses, creating a sense of hopelessness in the public, while simultaneously setting them up to make unpopular decisions. But no matter how much they tried to hide the real causes of the crisis, cracks in this narrative began to appear. This was sounded by independent economists and financial analysts, who began to publicly declare that the data presented did not match the real situation. Independent studies were showing that the deficits were greatly exaggerated and built on outdated or manipulated data. But this wave of criticism was quickly quelled by political press releases designed to prop up the existing narrative, creating a new layer of suspicion and accusations against those who were trying to expose reality. The task facing the government was obvious: to create a sense of chaos and crisis in order to propose its political program as the only true solution, justifying all steps by raising taxes and cutting social programs. In some places it worked, because as experience shows, when society is gripped by panic, it is ready to support almost any measure, just to maintain some illusion of stability. When the revelations about the manipulation of financial data began to gain publicity, the consequences for the government of Keir Starmer became inevitable. What began as quiet doubts soon grew into a powerful political revolt, both inside and outside the Labour Party. More and more MPs who had previously supported the government's course began to publicly express doubts about the accuracy of the data used to justify the massive austerity measures. Cracks began to appear within the Labour Party, which had long remained a solid political force. At first it was cautious hints and doubts in private meetings, but soon open calls for a review of the financial statements were growing louder. Some of the MPs admitted to feeling cheated, and this posed a real threat to Starmer's political stability. Just as importantly, political opposition soon joined this internal discontent. Conservatives, reformers, and even some liberal Democrats began actively demanding an independent inquiry into the origin and accuracy of the P's 22 billion deficit figures. This political reign did not stop, and the pressure on Starmer grew ever stronger. Questions were being asked not only inside Parliament, but also on social media, where users were actively debating how the government could have deceived millions of citizens by using false data to justify its economic measures. Social media became an important battleground for public opinion, and more people began to question the veracity of the government's claims. The massive dissemination of information about financial manipulation eventually sparked outrage in the streets. Protests in major cities became frequent, and they were not limited to political activists or opposition parties. Workers, pensioners, small entrepreneurs, all those who had been hit by harsh economic measures began to take to the streets demanding explanations. These demonstrations were a clear expression that citizens were no longer willing to remain silent as they watched their lives deteriorate due to policies based on deception. With each new protest, the question of the veracity of economic data became more pressing. In response to the growing crisis, Starmer tried to maintain his power by holding press conferences and issuing public statements claiming that the erroneous data was merely a misunderstanding and not part of a deliberate manipulation. However, such excuses could no longer satisfy the public. The internal divisions within the Labour Party only intensified. Total dissatisfaction among members of the government reached such a level that leaks began that several senior politicians no longer supported Starmer. One by one, MPs began to openly admit that they had been warned against using inflated figures and manipulating data, but they were hesitant to go against the party line. At some point, however, many realized that silence had cost too much, and now the moment of open rupture had arrived. Then, when the situation seemed almost hopeless for Starmer, his party faced its first real blow, the resignation of a high-profile minister right on air. That moment was a turning point. The statement by the minister, who blatantly pointed out errors and lies in the financial reports, shook public opinion and made Starmer's continued existence as party leader almost impossible. Keir Starmer's political career was in danger of being completely destroyed, but the most serious consequences came when the veracity of the whole financial picture began to be discussed at the level of government investigations. The Conservatives and opposition parties demanded an inquiry into how the government had managed to manipulate public opinion on deflation and the deficit. Questions about why the P's 22 billion figures had not been properly audited by independent financial auditors became a major topic of debate. There was a real threat to the reputation not only of Starmer, but of the entire Labour government, which now found itself under the scrutiny of Parliament and the press. What was even more dangerous for Starmer was that the P's 22 billion situation was not just a matter of economic misconduct or miscalculation. It was a question of credibility. The government's laboratory of political lies had led people to question not just the financial statements, but the very principles of government itself. Soon even those who initially supported the Labour Party began to renounce their party beliefs, seeing the government's actions as nothing more than political manipulation and a desire to hold on to power at all costs. With each passing day, the situation became more and more threatening for Starmer. Public discontent was growing, and more people began to ask why they had to suffer from high taxes and cuts in social benefits when there was no real financial crisis. Under such circumstances, Starmer's political stability began to seem quite impossible. The more the public demanded explanations, the more his own supporters and colleagues began to distance themselves from him. Against this backdrop, the threat of resignation grew, and what had seemed like a minor misunderstanding began to develop into one of Britain's most serious political upheavals. Thus, the exposure of the financial fraud was not just a blow to the Starmer government, but the beginning of a new political crisis in the country, where the government found itself at the center of a powerful stream of accusations of manipulation and manipulation of public opinion.